Welcome to the English Homemaker podcast, a podcast where we discuss all things home, a realistic but fresh view of homemaking from the suburbs of the south of England. I am your host, Alissa Evelyn. Welcome to episode 12 of the English Homemaker. Hello everybody, how are you today? I really hope you're having a great day, whatever it is that you're up to, whether you're folding laundry or doing the washing up or ironing or you're in the car, whatever you're up to. I really hope that you're feeling happy and healthy and ready to take on the world. This has been one of the hardest podcasts I've ever tried to record. And what that means in practicality is that I've had about 3 days where I could have sat here and recorded this podcast, but I've sat here and I've tried to record for probably about 6 to 8 hours, somewhere in that realm. And I've given up each time. And then one time I got about 15 minutes worth of recording time done. But when I listened back to it this morning, I just thought, no, it just sounds like I'm trying so hard to tell you what I think I should say. And you don't want to do that. I don't want this to be a podcast that feels grindy, because money is already hard for everybody, especially at the moment. And I want it to be light. I want it to be as joyful as it can be. I want it to be helpful. And I don't want it to feel like this, which I think most of the podcasts that I previously tried to record sounded very much like da 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 da. And I don't want it to sound like that at all. I want it to sound like there's hope. I want it to be uplifting. So I do hope that I can transmit that today. Money is just so difficult to talk about. I think everyone has a different relationship with it as well, which makes it doubly difficult. I am so aware that there is a huge spectrum of people listening. There will be people listening that have a huge amount of savings in the bank. Some of you will be learning how to save. Some of you will be just sort of getting by every day. And some of you will be in debt, trying to get out of it. And I'm aware that you all listening are coming from a different perspective and understanding. So I hope that the tips I share today do help every single one of you in some way. And as a last little disclaimer, please know I am not an expert at all. I have only been on this planet for 36 years. I do not know anything. I certainly don't know everything. And whilst you are listening to me and I am going to offer some advice, please don't take it as rote. Some of these things will be helpful to you and some won't. Please use your wisdom as to what is helpful and what is not. For instance, most of the tips that I'm going to share in this podcast pertain to the fact that I am home full time and I have way more time than I do money, which doesn't necessarily mean one is better than the other. It's just a choice that we have made. But also I'm aware that you may not be rich in either. You might have no time because you've got little kids, and you may also have no money, at which point I would hope that you're rich in something else like community or family or something that you can lean on. Really, my heart just goes out to each and every one of you listening. I know you're all in a unique situation, and everybody is going through hard things. So let's move on. I feel hugely hypocritical sat here. I feel like I'm desperately going to be judged by everybody listening. And I felt clearly like I needed to spend 4 minutes giving disclaimers for why I'm probably not the right person to talk about this, but I'm going to anyway. So let's move forward. The first tip I have to share for you, for everybody listening, is to budget. It doesn't matter how much money you do or don't have. I think everybody needs to be aware of where their money is going. It's so empowering and important to know. It stops marital arguments. I absolutely promise that. And it's super duper easy to do. You can have an app for it. I use an Excel spreadsheet. My grandmother, she writes it all down by hand. There are so many different ways to make sure you know where your money is going and keeping track of it. And I know some of you are like, oh, boring. But, you know, when you do it, honestly, I kind of find it a little bit addictive. Every single week I sit down and I log all of the incoming and outgoing transactions into our account and put them onto an Excel spreadsheet. I have 44 different columns in the spreadsheet. And I wish there were far fewer columns, quite frankly. I wish life was simpler than that. But right now there are 44, and they range from things like mortgage to groceries. Some of them are fixed costs, so things like the water bill, the electric, the gas, the council tax, the phone payments, the internet payments, the TV license, those sort of things that come out every single month. We try and make them come out of the account the day after payday. just to make sure that we don't have any surprises later in the month, although some of them can't be moved. We try and make them as close to that day as possible. And then we have variable costs, so things like the groceries, petrol, eating out, takeaways, our own personal budgets for things like clothes, and then gifting, home improvements, house upkeep, postage costs, activities, haircuts. And whilst some of those are a bit sort of both, they're variable costs. Some of them are very necessary, some of them are nice to haves. And we talk about those things all of the time. All of the time. They're the things we probably have most arguments about between me and my husband, because we probably differ a fair amount on how we would spend in each of those categories. But we're getting more and more alike as time goes on. We've been married for 11 years now. So then at the end of every single year, we sit down, me and my husband, and we have a conversation about how we've spent in the last year. We look towards the budget for the next year that I've put together, and we see how we feel about it. We have a really good, deep conversation about whether what we're spending reflects how we want to live. And we make sure that when we're moving forwards into the next year, it's reflective of that. So that is my first tip. I have been keeping a budget for 20 years now, and I would not do without it. So my second tip is a little bit more kind of mindset based, but we live in a world that is surrounded by advertising and marketing, and you cannot get away from it. Even with entertainment, you can't get away from advertising and marketing. And I think my second tip is simply just to be aware of where you're letting that advertising and marketing in, and be aware of how it's affecting you, and teach that to your kids as well. I think this is my major pitfall as a homemaker, is being an absolute sucker to the adverts and letting them in far too often as well. I think I've fallen prey to the fact that I feel like I need to buy some collagen so I look younger. I feel like I need to buy a diary in order to be more organised. Maybe I feel like I need to get Netflix so I can watch the latest show, so I can be like cool and fit in with everyone and have those conversations. But actually, we don't need any of those things. It's all marketing, and we let that in. And there's nothing wrong with having a collagen smoothie in the morning, or using a diary, or watching Netflix. I think it's when you feel like you need to, like you'll be less than if you don't, and making sure that your mindset is right and you're happy without those things, and that you're consciously choosing them. In the same way, actually, our kind of whole Western modern society is set up on the basis that we need a certain set of things in order to exist, like a toaster or a television or a computer or a smartphone or a credit card or holidays abroad. Some of those things, well, all of those are nice to have. They're not necessary. I mean, some of those things might be necessary for your job or something, but we don't need them to survive. We can get on perfectly well without them. And there's a whole minimalist, simple living movement that would argue that the fewer things that you have, the happier you are. And I feel very much like I agree with that movement, that generally the less I have, the less things I have to look after, the less burdened I feel, the happier I feel. And the more I declutter my house, the more obvious that becomes. So then the next thing I would suggest is, instead of trying to reduce the time you spend with adverts and marketing, because I think that's actually very challenging, I think I would just encourage you to spend more time doing things like being in nature, reading books, spending time with friends and family, where just naturally advertising and marketing does not exist, where we're not encouraged to spend a bunch of money, where we're not getting a new idea for a new book that we need to buy or a new project we need to start, where we can just kind of be and enjoy and spend time in the present. And if you think back historically, pre-electricity, not that long ago, people would have sat in the evenings with a friend, maybe you'd have crafted, perhaps you'd have popped to the pub for a pint, maybe you'd have gone on a walk, maybe you'd spend the whole evening cleaning and tidying ready for the next day, or been preparing food. Maybe you'd pick up your knitting needles or your crochet hook and carry on with the project. Maybe you would just go to sleep, spend time having a conversation with your husband. We are so good as a society at distracting ourselves and feeling like we need the next thing, and always working on the next project and how we can improve and optimize. And I find all of that very enticing, but also very exhausting. And I want so badly just to always live the simple life. So then tip number 3 is simply gratitude. Being grateful for the things that you already have is so key. It's so important that we do that on a daily, hourly basis and remind ourselves how blessed we already are with the things that we have, with the people that we have, with the situation we're in. I cannot express enough how important that is. And if you can start the day in that way, so much the better. So try and figure different ways of practicing gratitude in your life. I don't feel like I need to go on and on for a long time with this, because I think most of us know what we need to do but aren't always practicing it. I feel super convicted in this area. I know it's something I really need to grow in and work on. And I think going forward, something I'd like to remember to do more often until it becomes actual regular habit is just giving thanks over our evening meal. Whether you believe in God or not, or whatever your faith is, I just think you can always say thank you for your food. You can say thank you to the farmer. You can say thank you to the person that made the food, you cooked the food, grew the food, delivered the food, the person who enabled you to sit in a safe house. You can say thank you for all of the people joining you around the table and just be grateful that everybody's there. There are so many things we can be grateful for when we sit down for our evening meal. And it's also an opportunity, if you have a family and you have younger kids or older kids, anybody, it's an opportunity for everyone to say something that they're grateful for that's happened that day. And that kind of attitude of gratitude is so important. It stops entitlement. It stops that I deserve it kind of mentality, which is such a dangerous one. And I think that's something that I really want to make sure we do. We do it occasionally at the minute, but we don't always remember to do it. And it's something I think that we could really do with more of in our household. The next thing is another big picture thing. I think it's really important to look at the big picture things because I think they affect so many of those day-to-day decisions. And I think it's so important to look at the way you think about things, because that can really, really affect how you purchase and what you spend your money on. So the next thing is to have a family culture where you question what is normal. Do you know that quote by Goodman, the one that goes, "Normal is getting dressed in clothes that you buy for work and driving through traffic in a car that you are still paying for. In order to get to the job, you need to pay for the clothes and the car and the house you leave vacant all day so you can afford to live in it." I have a love-hate relationship with this quote. I really, really do. It drives me crazy. I think it's absolutely fabulous because it kind of just questions everything, but it kind of doesn't really give you any answers. And obviously, we need people to be normal. We need people to get dressed and get in their car and go to work. But I think what it does for me, this quote, is say, is there a different way of doing it? Is there a way of turning it on its head? And I think that's why we are a generation that is turning things on its head. We are doing multi-generational living. We are living in tiny homes. We are running homesteads in the country. And especially since COVID, I have seen so many families I know where the husband used to work outside of the home, now works from home and is the one that does the pickup from school. So family life has shifted so majorly even in the last 3 years. Not only that with COVID, but it made us question where we wanted to live and how we wanted home to be. So loads of people I know moved to the countryside. Lots of people moved to bigger houses, more outside space. Lots and lots of people moved to be closer to family or to go back to their childhood areas. So much movement happened during COVID because people realised what home needed to be for them. And I suppose most of you listening were affected by that as well. If we circle back to talking about writing down a budget, these two can go really hand in hand. So you can look at your budget and work out, why am I doing this? Is this something I'm doing because everyone else does it? Is this something I also need to be doing? Or is there a different way of doing this? So the next thing I want to talk about is another heart thing. It's another mindset shift. For a lot of you, it's not going to be a shift. It's just going to be a reminder. And perhaps we can explore some practical ways to do this together. So the next thing I want to talk about is generosity. So the two big G's, gratitude and generosity. I think they both play such an important role in how we think money actually works. Now, if you've ever been a Christian or read the Bible, you'll know the Bible has so much to talk about money, and a lot of what it talks about money is about how the more you give, the more you will receive. And I think almost every single other spiritual path or religion will talk about generosity as being a very positive thing. Maybe it's the opposite of greed. Maybe it's a way to heaven. Maybe it's the understanding of karma, that idea of cause and effect, the idea that what you put out into the world will come back to you at some point. But what I want to focus on today is actually an article. That article is called The Serviceberry, and it's written by Robin Wall Kimmerer. You can read it on emergencemagazine.org, and if you are listening to this podcast, you will probably love reading it. It was my brother and sister-in-law that alerted me to this article. It really is worth a read, so do stop listening to this now if you are safe to do so and have the time to just sit and read this article. I will make sure the link is in the show notes. For now, I'm just going to read a little snippet. This problem of managing decisions about abundance reminds me of a report that linguist Daniel Everett wrote as he was learning from a hunter-gatherer community in the Brazilian rainforest. A hunter had brought home a sizable kill, far too much to be eaten by his family. The researcher asked how he would store the excess. Smoking and drying technologies were well known. Storing was possible. The hunter was puzzled by the question. Store the meat? Why would he do that? Instead, he sent out an invitation to a feast, and soon the neighbouring families were gathered around his fire until every last morsel was consumed. This seemed like maladaptive behaviour to the anthropologist, who asked again, given the uncertainty of meat in the forest, why didn't he store the meat for himself, which is what the economic system of his home culture would predict? Store my meat? I store my meat in the belly of my brother, replied the hunter. Wouldn't it be amazing if we lived in a culture where we weren't marked as being wealthy by how much money we had in the bank, but by how much we gave away? Wouldn't that be amazing? The really wealthy people were the ones who were the most generous. And I don't know about you, but when I think to my later years, when I think about how I want to be remembered, when I think about how I want to be known as someone who is generous. I want to be known as someone who opens my house to people, who's always ready with a good meal and maybe a cookie and a hot drink. I'd love in my eulogy if people just said she was very generous with her smiles. She was generous with her time. She was always ready on the phone if you wanted a phone call. And investing in the belly of your neighbour is just a much safer place for your stuff to be, if that makes sense. It can't get stolen. It can't get lost. It can't get set on fire. And if you're ever in a pickle and you've invested into those neighbours and friends and families and brothers and sisters, they will help you in tricky times. And I see that time and time again. So shall we talk about a few practical things we can do to be a little bit more generous? Now, I do kind of want to focus obviously on money. That's what we're talking about today, but you can be generous in so many different ways. But I do think that even if you don't have very much material wealth, that you can still be generous with stuff. So say, for example, it's blackberry picking time. Maybe you take an extra punnet, fill it up, and actually give it to your neighbour. Maybe you get into the habit of sharing your baked goods when you make them. I know often I make a big cake and we can't eat it all together. So I think about who I could invite over. Or if I make cookies, who can we take it to share it with? Because it's so much more delicious when you share things. Obviously, you can kind of give in more obvious ways with your money. You can give financial donations to charities. There are so many different ones to choose from. And you don't need to give a lot to charities. It's not a competition. You don't need to give like £1,000. You can just give 50p or £1 into a donation box, and that all adds up. And then I'm really, really inspired by kind of radical generosity. There was a man on the Graham Norton show the other day, which I do watch occasionally. I kind of think it's so much fun and you learn so much about people. There was one of the men from the repair shop on there, and he was telling his story. He was saying about when he was 45, he was really kind of at death's door. He did not want to live anymore, and he found himself in a hospital with a bunch of kind of psychiatric nurses, and just a random man, just came alongside him, embraced him, told him that everything was going to be okay, and told him that he could live with his parents for a couple of weeks just to kind of get him back onto his feet and get him feeling loved again. And his story was just so inspiring. Just this random man with this big heart who used the resources that he had to just help this man feel more loved and part of a community. And that brought me to tears and made me just feel so inspired. We have these spaces and these resources in our homes, in our lives, that we could share, that we don't as much as we could. I'm just inspired by the idea that we are one whole community, not just ourselves on a little island, massing wealth and kind of doing our own thing, but that we are all interconnected. And I have mentioned that, I feel like, in so many different podcasts. And yes, it is harder and scarier to be generous. It just is. It's so much easier, more comfortable to stay by yourself in your little island. And there's also no guarantee of return or fame for your doing something great. And I don't think there should be. I kind of think, and I guess probably lots of religions would agree with this, that you should give without expecting anything in return. And I challenge you actually this Christmas, when you're writing your gift list, not to write it based on who's going to give you presents in return or who you feel deserves a gift, but write it in such a way that it comes really from your heart of wanting to give and be generous to those people. But wouldn't it be lovely if at Christmas time, when we're opening our presents, we're not focused on the presents that we're opening and what we're getting and receiving, but I have found, especially over the years, it's changed and flipped the other way, that I have some presents sat beside me, but I'm mostly watching to see the reaction of the people opening the presents I have picked for them. And that is so much more joy than opening the presents that they've given me. Not because they give me rubbish presents, not at all. Lots of people give me great presents, but just the joy of giving for me is so much greater. I think you probably get the message by this point. As homemakers, the best and most amazing thing we can be generous with is our home, making sure it's in a position where you're always happy to have people come and spend time in it, feel like it's a sanctuary for them, and just make it cozy and lovely. And that's kind of what this podcast is about. Okay, let's move on to tip number 5, 6, 7, I don't know, somewhere in there, 5 maybe. Be inspired by minimalism. Now, you don't have to be a minimalist. I am certainly not a minimalist. I have a lot of stuff in this house. I am inspired very much by maximalist home decoration, but be inspired by minimalists. Be organized. Don't have more stuff than you need, and make your life work in such a way that it isn't overwhelming for you, that you have the right amount of stuff that you can manage, that it is not managing you, it's not controlling you, you're not spending all of your money paying for it and looking after it, that your life makes sense and is simple enough to manage. There are 1,000 different resources for minimalism out there, thousands of different YouTubers with lots of videos and information on how to live a more minimalist lifestyle in all the different areas of your life. So go and check them out. If that's not an area you've been inspired by before, just go and have a little look, have a little Google and see what you can find. There's always so many resources and ideas in that area. The next tip is to do some kind of challenge, some kind of low buy, no buy, budget challenge. Back in 2011, I did a challenge called the Big Budget Challenge. It was run by another blogger at the time, and this is back when my blog was really mostly about food. And it was so interesting to me to do that. It was interesting to see how much money I could save doing it. It was interesting that when I got very intentional about what I was doing and looked at even like historical recipes for inspiration, there is so many ways that we can save money, especially when it comes to food. But yes, you can make kind of challenges about anything. Most of us have everything that we need for now. We don't need to buy more stuff on Amazon. We really don't. We've probably got enough craft supplies, we've probably got enough books, we've probably got enough clothes to keep us going. And if we're really intentional about what we're buying and we say it's going to be a low buy year, for example, and say I'm only going to buy socks and pants if I need to replace them, or maybe I'm going to buy one good coat because I know the one is wearing through, and we're intentional about that, it stops so many unnecessary purchases and will really, really help save money. And I've definitely found that doing that for myself, even for short periods of time where I know I'm saving towards something, is so empowering. It can show you really how well you can do when you put your mind to it. Now, I know what you're thinking because I'm thinking it too, and you're thinking this is all very well and good, Alissa, but I'm just too tired. I'm too tired to optimize everything. I'm too tired to keep on top of everything. I'm too busy. I have too many other more important things in my life to keep in track of, and balancing everything is just too much. Now, I kind of hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you probably already know this, that life doesn't get easier, generally gets harder and more complicated. And one thing you can do to make your life easier is to ease financial pressure. So putting in place some of these things will actually make life easier, albeit harder in the short term. I think one of the best ways to do this is to make sure you have a really clear goal and vision for the future. Maybe it's something really specific. Maybe it's just a kind of overall picture of how you want your life to be, to go, and how you want it to feel. And that's what you're working towards. That's what you're saving towards. That's what you're making those changes for. And if it's not a strong enough goal or vision, you're just not going to do it. And I find times in my life where I'm kind of flailing and drowning and struggling to make decisions, it's generally where me and my husband don't feel like we're quite on the same page. We don't share the same goal for the future. That happened and happens, I think, a lot to people after they have kids. Is they've made a plan for like where they're going to live and how many kids they're going to have, and once they've achieved that, they kind of get to this point of, oh, hang on, we've now got like another 20 years before we hit retirement. Like, what are we going to do? What is our goal for our family? How do we want our family to run? And I see the families that are like quite clear about how that's supposed to be, how it's going to be, generally being more positive, optimistic, not necessarily always saving more money, but being very intentional with the choices and decisions they're making with those bigger things in their lives. Okay, now it's time to stop big picture, deep chat and talk about little changes you can make every day to save some money, to live a beautiful life on a budget. So the first one will come as zero surprise to any of you, and that is to plan your meals. Not only does it save me so much money, genuinely, it means I am not in the shops nearly as often, so it saves on petrol. It means that we have way more delicious meals, which just increases everyone's enjoyment, and it makes sure that everyone's got a really nutritionally balanced meal, which again keeps everyone happier. It also means I'm able to plan for extra guests. It means I'm able to think through the timing and logistics of things. So for example, say we have beavers on a Tuesday night, maybe that's the day I choose to have a slow cook meal, or I've made double batch the day before. I just love that meal planning helps put me in control of the situation rather than sitting and thinking, oh no, everyone needs to eat. Okay, what's in the fridge? Like, what can we make with what we've got? Instead, we're all really excited about what we're going to eat. Everyone knows they can look at the meal plan if they want to, and I've probably prepared a few things ahead of time, so I'm not caught off guard. I made a YouTube video about this a while back. I'll make sure that's linked in the show notes, which kind of explains my process of how I meal plan. It's pretty much still the same as that video actually, but now I make sure for sure that I plan for every single meal in the day, including snacks. The other thing that saves me money about meal planning is that then I can do my entire shop on the app on my phone, and it saves me so much money doing it like that because I'm not buying extras. It means I can really tap down on the cost per gram, and it means I'm not making changes to the meal plan whilst I'm in store and I'm looking at something. I can see online whether, say, there's a deal on chicken versus a deal on beef, and I kind of make my meal plan accordingly based on what's on offer. Now, trying to do that in store would just be so much harder. Not impossible, but definitely harder. It would take me more time. And actually, I really enjoy the evenings where I get to sit and meal plan. It probably takes me about half an hour. Sometimes it's taken me a bit longer. Obviously, the more I do it, the less time it takes. And some days I'm just like really foggy and it takes me even longer. But I try and make it into a nice time. I sit, I get a cup of tea once the kids have gone to bed, I get out the cookbook. Sometimes I'd certainly get out a pen and paper, and I just kind of think about what the shape of our week looks like and what kind of meals we're going to need, and then I sort of start filling in the holes. And I find it tremendously satisfying when I finish and I come up with a great meal plan. And without doubt, not only have I saved money that week, but at the end of every day, everyone feels really satisfied. They've had meals with actual vegetable sides, they've had really nutritious snacks, and I've really thought about everything we're going to need. And there's no panic, because without a meal plan, we have a panic of, oh, we don't have rolls for lunches, or oh, we've run out of milk, or oh, we didn't have XYZ. It just makes everything much less stressful and more enjoyable. Now, you might be the type of person who actually really loves going to the shops, so no diss, but do make sure you take a meal plan with you. And I'd suggest making sure that the meals you have in your meal plan are able to be varied by the season and what's on offer in the supermarket at the time, especially if you're going into the shop. So say, for example, you're doing a curry, or you're doing a quiche, or you're doing a lasagna, you can vary that by the season and what you have on offer. So say chicken is on offer versus beef, you can have a chicken curry or a chicken quiche or a chicken jacket potato. But say it's beef, you can swing it back the other way. So there are all these kind of base recipes, base ideas that then you can adjust based on what's in season. And often what's in season is what's cheapest, most abundant, not always. Which leads me to my next point, which is to find your local sources of protein and kind of maximize them. So this is a tip from my brother who moved to Sweden. When he moved to Sweden, he found his local sources of protein. He found he had a dairy farmer nearby, struck up a relationship with him, and learnt how to make cheese from that so that his family would always have cheese and he could get that milk for a really good price. I thought that was such a good tip because everybody listening to this podcast, I know you all come from all across the world, and every single different part of the world and every even very small specific part of even every country has its own food systems, has its own farming practices, has its own plants, animals, vegetables that thrive in that area and that you can get your hands on for a good price. Now, I do think this is an area, especially in England, where we have to be a bit sneaky and clever, because quite often what's local, they actually mark up, especially if you buy it in a farm shop. Often if you can buy it direct, you'll get a better price, but you have to look at it slightly differently and ask a lot of questions. I think there is so much sense in eating as local as possible and also looking at food traditions in the area that you live, because so many of those are based on foods that are cheap and readily available and how to stretch them. So if you take Italy and cucina povera, for example, you'll find amazing dishes like risotto, minestrone, pizza, pasta, beans and pasta. It's about celebrating and lifting up those very simple ingredients like tomatoes and wheat and making them into as many different things as you can to get that variety and just celebrate them as ingredients. Try them in different ways. There are so many different ways to just do even those two things. Another way to save on food is to reduce the amount of meat that you're eating and increase the amount of beans and lentils, because there's a huge cost saving to be found there. Another tip I love for saving money when it comes to food is to try and make sure I include a couple of slow cooked meals every week. And as I said before, that actually is something I make sure to plan in depending on when we're like kind of out for activities in the evenings. It is so lovely to come home to the slow cooker on and the smell of the stew cooking, and especially if it's cold and crisp outside, it just is one of the best feelings ever. And it's also that kind of hug that you give yourself from having prepared and loved yourself earlier in the day or the day before, of putting it on and getting everything ready. And it's so nice on so many levels, and it does save money cooking in a slow cooker versus using the oven. Say you had a casserole in the oven for about an hour, it would cost that about 30 pence. But if you were to put that same casserole in a slow cooker and cook it for about an 8-hour period on low, it would cost you 10.5 pence. So you're saving 20 pence, which will mount up over the course of a year and a lifetime. The last food tip I have is to cook from scratch as much as you can and prepare food from scratch. So I try and do this not just for cost saving, but also for my health, because you know exactly what's gone into everything. So personally, I do a lot of from scratch cooking. I make my own broth, I make my own granola, I make my own bread, both sourdough, regular sourdough, and a gluten-free sourdough. I make all of my own jams and marmalades, and I make my own yogurt. And all of those things do save me money over time. And I absolutely love doing all of those things as well. And the thing with all of those things I've just mentioned is that they're pretty basic things to learn. I think for a lot of it, it's just a bit of trial and error, maybe having a jam that doesn't set very well once, maybe having a bread that doesn't rise quite as well. But I think there's something lovely about some of these longer processes that are amazing and important for the homemaker to do, because it actually really connects you with your home. I love being tied to place because of something I'm doing practically in the kitchen. For example, if I'm making several of these things in one day, which I often do, and I did yesterday, I just have it as this sort of bit of a dance, this relationship with me and the kitchen and the house in general. So there's a spot in the house where I leave the sourdough to rise. There's a spot where I leave the yogurt to ferment. There's a spot where I know there'll be bubbling, boiling stock. And there's something lovely about all of those smells and all of those feelings. And especially on days where I have to do the sourdough as well, I have to be in the house. It ties me to my home. I guess I think there's something very romantic about all of that kind of slow food prep. Like, it kind of connects us to the past, a bit like when you put your washing out on a line, that same feeling of touching a bit of history, the way things were done for such a long time, and the way that women would have been in the home and in the kitchen almost constantly. I feel like there are so many ways of saving money when it comes to food. Things like making your own hot beverages, making your own coffee at home, harvesting in the wild, batch cooking, growing some of your own food and herbs. Maybe you stop drinking alcohol for a while. I feel like I could go on and on, but I'm going to leave food there for a while. It's been like half the podcast. And now I'm going to move on to talking about the house, your home. The main thing I want to talk about when it comes to home, well, there's two. So the first thing is to not care what other people think. I think this is something that we all get ourselves trapped in. We all have an expectation of ourselves. We all feel like we might be judged based on what our house looks like inside. And we all need to get to a position where we don't care what other people think, whether we're worried that they think it's going to be clean enough or modern enough or functional enough or eco enough or any of those things. We just need to kind of just throw it out the window and actually live within our means and really find what we like, not just kind of like blindly follow the next trend, which, by the way, the whole idea of trends is just makes me really crazy when it comes to anything, whether it's fashion or skincare or home decor or cars. Whatever the latest trend is really just a great way of getting money out of you for making you feel less than if you don't have it. I'd love if everyone could just like get rid of that idea. That would be great. And then the second thing to say about the home is to just look after the things that you've got really well, to clean them, to look after them. And even if you don't like them right now, so let me give you an example. Right now, my staircase is covered in this carpet. We bought the house with the carpet. Goodness knows how many years it's been there. It's kind of skanky, but we keep it. It still functions. There's no urgency to fix it. It's not our budget priority. But I clean that thing. I clean it. I hoover it almost every day, actually, because it gets really mucky so quickly. It's not what I would choose, but I feel like I need to be a good steward of the things I've been given. And once I can learn to live with the things that I have that I don't like, it will make the enjoyment of the things that I have earned and worked towards so much sweeter and so much greater. Now, all's that to say, if someone gave me a spare like 50 grand tomorrow, I couldn't like completely redo my house in a way I felt was absolutely perfect, that I would be any less happy with it, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not saying that if you can afford to just go ahead and do it, that you'll enjoy it less. I guess ultimately, I never really want to go in debt for my house any more so than my mortgage already costs me. And I also don't want to lose money unnecessarily by breaking something just because I didn't look after it well. The last thing I really want to talk about is thrifting and mending. This is a very old school way of looking at the home, in which a lot of things would be homemade and certainly would be mended. Things were precious 100, 200 years ago. They cost a lot of money and they would need to be used for a long time. We put a lot of emphasis in this family on when we're purchasing something, thinking about how long that something's going to last. So we'd rather spend a bit more money on something that lasts a lot longer than purchasing something cheap that's then going to need to be replaced every year. For us, the classic example is the toaster. Now, buying a new toaster is actually quite a complicated procedure. You can either buy a really basic one from Argos, probably for about £10-15, I reckon. Maybe you can buy kind of middling range one, which is probably where most people settle in at £30 to £60. Maybe it's a little bit better, maybe it looks a little bit fancier, slightly less plasticky. And then there's top of the range ones, which are sort of 200, 250. And one year we were going to replace our toaster. We were definitely in that middling range previously, and we're just sort of frustrated with the functionality. And I went onto this website called buymeonce.com, which shows you some really high-end, well-made, possibly replaceable parts kind of thing products. And I looked for toasters, and I found the most perfect toaster that will last us literally the rest of our lives. Every part of it is repairable, replaceable, and it's a very classic, simple design. It's the Dualit New Gen 4-slice. It was £200. I think we got it as a gift from my mother-in-law. Perhaps we split it. I don't remember. She's very generous, so she probably just purchased it for us one Christmas. And we have a toaster that we will never ever have to replace, and it seemed for sure worth the investment in the short term to make gains in the long term. So I feel like that happens a lot with purchases of things. You think you're buying something cheap, but actually it's very expensive because it needs replacing so often. Now, not everything in our house is as optimized as our toaster. We would like it to be, but that's a very expensive way of living. And maybe one day everything will be repairable and crafted and beautiful. But for now, we make do with what we have, and we replace things with top quality things when they need replacing and not really before then. Now, you might come into a situation where you're wanting to buy something quality, but you're really struggling to find it because currently not everything is made in a really quality way. And thankfully, that's where secondhand shops come in, because a lot of older furniture was made in a much better, higher quality standard way. And secondhand furniture can sometimes be so much better. Even the other day, we went into a solid pine furniture shop. We were looking for a wardrobe for my daughter, and we were so kind of saddened by the lack of quality, even in what should have been the highest quality that we could find furniture shop. So secondhand is a really, really good way to go, especially if you can see it and touch it first. Make sure there are no scrapes, gashes, funny smells. And that's the other thing, is skills. If you can work on gaining some kind of skills, whether that's woodworking, sanding, painting, mending clothes, sewing on buttons, any kind of skills like that will save you so much money. So even if you can get something as basic as sewing on a button, it means then you don't throw out the shirt that lost the button. It means you can fix the button and keep wearing it instead of buying a new one. So I'm going to leave the podcast there. That is plenty of tips and advice. It's probably too much. And if you've made it to the end, well done. And if you didn't write some of those things down and you want to, please go back, listen to it again with a pen and paper. Write some things down that you want to move forward in. And even if you don't move forward with them today, then at least you've got a little bit of a plan, or maybe there's things that you just want to remember. Also, as I said at the beginning, not all of that was for everybody. Everybody has a different opinion of money, a different understanding of how it works, and it's totally cool if you disagree with me, always. So please do send me messages. I'd love to hear what you think about this topic. It's so big, and I know all of you will have opinions, and if you want to share them, please share them with me. I'd love to hear them. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope you check back soon for a new podcast episode. Bye.